Back when my grandfather's grandfather was labouring the land, Parliament chose to pass what were known as the Corn Laws. The stated intent of these was to restrict foreign imports of grain and so ensure a healthy profit for native farmers. In reality, of course, it simply gave landowners licence to stockpile said grain and drive the price up past the point where ordinary folk could afford to feed themselves. So, before long, hunger began to grip the land, forcing those without means to eat nettles and rosehips and even the mangel-wurzels grown as animal fodder to keep themselves fed. Of course, these were no substitute for bread, and so before long the common folk of the West Country turned to an older and more honoured tradition. Ever since the enclosure of the common land, only the lord of the manor, his guests, or those acting in his service have been legally allowed to harvest game from the land. Anyone else who took a rabbit or a fowl or a fish from what used to be owned by all was named a poacher and severely punished for it. Sometimes hands were taken, sometimes transportation was the penalty, other times the noose awaited. Anything to deter the common man taking from the inheritance that was ceded to him through Adam, and feeding themselves when needs be. Of course, there were always those that knew how to sneak in and out without getting caught, and there was always a need for some meat for the pot, especially at times of great hunger. So men who had this skill were often highly regarded. One such man lived in the same village my mother grew up in, a village by the name of Stratton. No one remembers his first name, but everyone agrees that Jackman was his last. He lived in the village just around the time that the Corn Laws came to pass, and he was taught the craft of poaching by his uncle after his father passed away. Unlike others who would often use a snare or a gun to bag their quarry, Jackman avoided the gamekeeper's attention by developing a method that was silence itself. Rather than stalk his game or trap it, Jackman would simply find a quiet spot in the woods and sit there, holding out a hand for the feed. Then, before long, some creature would shuffle up and start nibbling at the feast laid out in front of it. While the creature was content and distracted, Jackman would seize him gently, then take a sharp knife and do him in quickly and quiet. He never made a sport of it or took pleasure in the fellow creature's suffering. He just took what he needed for the pot and let the rest be. Soon enough, though, his skill was in high demand, and before long everyone in the village was getting a little something from Jackman to keep the hunger at bay. Not a lot, mind, as they didn't want to draw the landowner's ire, but just enough. Then, one night while he was out in the woodland, nothing came to him. Not a rabbit or a pheasant or a pigeon or a skylark, not even the smallest morsel. It wasn't the first night he'd gone back empty-handed, but then the same thing happened the following night, and then the night after that, and the night after that. Before long, weeks had gone by without him bringing back anything, and soon enough people started to get hungry. There's a madness that seizes folk when hunger takes hold, when they find themselves watching their little ones bent over and begging for a meal. They get past a certain point and, well, desperation, anger and panic kick in. And when that happens, even if you've been their salvation up till then, they'll soon start treating you like their curse. So it was that the threats began, the accusations of hoarding and the taunts about his skill. Then soon enough he found himself surrounded by a group of men armed with sticks and rope, telling him in no uncertain terms that he was to get something for their tables or face the consequences. So, he returned to the woods that night, hoping to come across something, but by the time daybreak struck he'd found nary a thing. That was, of course, until he looked towards a nearby field and saw a flock of walking mutton. Taking livestock wasn't like taking game. Game can't be counted easily, but livestock can. Plus there's gates and fences and men looking over them. Nevertheless, people were hungry, desperate, and apt to take that desperation out on him if they didn't get something to eat soon. So, that night, as soon as the last of the light went out of the sky and the shepherds were secure in their hut, finishing the last of the day's scrumpy, Jackman crept up to the darkest corner at the furthest end of the field, and there he waited with one hand outstretched. It didn't take long for one of the sheep to amble up and start eating, and when it did, he did what was necessary. He made sure it didn't suffer or cry out. He simply did the deed and took it back to where it was needed. After he'd done the butchering and handed out portions of mutton to his neighbours, he made sure to bury its fleece and its bones deep as he could. Unfortunately, though, it was all for nothing. The theft of a sheep is nothing like the taking of a few rabbits, and so it wasn't long before the landowner and the local militia descended upon the village. I'd like to tell you that his neighbours stood fast and kept silent, but when confronted with muskets and the threat of the noose, few men are so stalwart. So, One by one, they pointed their fingers at Jackman. Once seized, he wasn't taken to the local magistrate or held in Dorchester jail. Back in those days, landowners could pretty much do as they liked. If they weren't the local magistrate or MP themselves, then they were sure to be either related to them or share some other type of close bond. Besides, they didn't just own all the land for miles. They owned everything on it. All the houses, the buildings, the birds, the trees, livestock, grain and water. So, while feudalism may have ended on paper when Parliament took over from the king, it was still very much the reality for all those who were literally tied to the land. As such, the landowner, the lord of the manor, the man the local populace simply referred to as master, could often inflict what penalties he liked. In the case of Jackman, he decided that as he'd taken the game from his table, he would take the food from his mouth. As such, he instructed his men to march Jackman over Ash Hill to a copse of trees on the outskirts of the village, where there lay a large stone block fixed with a great iron ring that was once used to secure shire horses. There, they stripped him naked, flogged him brutally, and then chained him to that stone to be starved to death. To ensure that the sentence was carried out properly, he left 3 of his men to watch over Jackman as he wasted away. However, the men he left were not as steadfast as their master believed, and so as soon as darkness began to creep over the sky, they promptly fell asleep. Not one to let such an opportunity go to waste, Jackman's mother loaded up a basket with bread, cheese and milk, and under the cover of darkness snuck towards her child to feed him. Each night she did this, and each night the snoring of the guards covered her escape. So, after 5 days chained to that rock, he was still fit and healthy. In the old days, if a man was sentenced to death but fate intervened to save him, it was taken as a sign that he was innocent of his crimes and he was given reprieve. However, this was not to be in Jackman's case. When the lord of the manor returned to see Jackman thriving, he had his guards flogged for shirking their duty and placed a metal gag around Jackman's mouth. Unaware of this, his mother turned up at the usual time that night, basket in hand, expecting the guards to be sleeping, only to find them alert and invigorated by their master's displeasure. Not content with simply killing her son, the landowner decided an example had to be set, and so ordered a gallows built in full sight of the stone her son was tethered to. Also, they can say their goodbyes, he said, when in fact he was simply amused by their tears. So, at midday the following day, Jackman's mother was hung in front of her son. It wasn't an easy hanging either. Rather than break her neck, they let her dangle until her face bloated and her bowels emptied. 3 days after, Jackman passed as well, all the while chewing at his chains in the vain hope he might cut through them. They weren't forgotten though. Despite the fact that their neighbours had to bow and scrape and tug their forelocks and shout, "Morning, master," with a fake smile every time the landowner passed, they found a way to remember Jackman and his mother. Not long after the hanging, they built a low-lying socket in the earth, made out of Portland stone just big enough for the base of a wooden cross inscribed with their names. That way, whenever the master was away, Jackman and his mother could have their memorial. However, whenever he returned, it could be discreetly hidden. The wooden cross is long since rotted away, but the stone socket is still there, and today it's known by all as Jackman's Cross. In fact, when my mother was just a girl, long before Granny Collins took her on her walk, it was something of a tradition for the older children to take the younger ones up there and tell them Jackman's story. Some of the bravest would even stay the night there. My mother never did, but another lad named Mickey Damon, who my mother used to tell me stories about when I was younger, took the challenge one night. He didn't have much to tell in the morning, but the one thing my mother has always remembered him saying is that he had a terrible time sleeping, for there was something behind him that just wouldn't stop chewing.